And then with the fossil record, where there's fascinating information in the fossils, there's biological molecules that are still present in the fossils. So, like I've heard stories where construction workers will dig up dinosaur bones and it just smells like dead animals, still.
Oh, wow.
You know, these bones are supposed to be 65, 100 million years old, and yet they still smell like dead animals. And when we look at dinosaur bones, when we dissolve, like we'll drop the bone in acid, and it'll dissolve away the minerals, but it'll leave the biological material, it'll leave the protein, and we can see those proteins. Some of them are still stretchy.
Right.
We've even found DNA in some material that are supposed to be hundreds of thousands or even millions of years old.
I know in the last like 10, 15 years, there's been lots of discoveries where they have found some tissue on, you know, for a Tyrannosaurus rex that shouldn't have been there supposedly, or other dinosaurs, and this has been happening fairly frequently, and in fact, there's been some pushback by academia regarding these findings, and the scientists who are finding this stuff aren't creationists. They're not Christians, and they're saying, look, we're finding things that don't make a lot of sense, that's defying our theories.
There's a Salado formation, it's salt, it's in Texas, and it's supposed to be 250 million years old, but they've pulled bacteria out of little bubbles of water in the salt and cultured it, they grow it, they looked at the DNA, it's still alive.
Wow.
So it's a bit like walking into a cabin in the woods and you find a glass of milk on the table, and maybe there's a hamster in a cage and it's still fresh and the hamster's doing fine.
Right.
Like, you know, it hasn't been there for 100 years.
Right, right.
And so we find the same thing in geology.
That's a great illustration. So is there geological data that does make the world look old? And what do you do with that?
There is. So the big clock that scientists use is radiometric dating. So unfortunately, like in movies, it often comes up as carbon dating. That's not right. Carbon dating is a small part of radiometric dating. So for example, if we have a chunk of uranium, uranium turns into lead, throws off a lot of radiation, turns into lead over time. And so if I have a brick of uranium and I know that it started off 100% uranium, now it's 10% lead, then as long as nobody added lead and as long as the decay rate is constant, then I can plug some numbers into a calculator and I can tell you how old it is, theoretically, as long as my assumptions are correct.
Right.
But what's interesting is that there's internal inconsistency in radiometric dating, even though it's the big clock that everyone uses. There's internal inconsistency because if I find in a similar layer, in similar location stratigraphically, in the layer in the geologic record, maybe I find something, a crystal with uranium in it and something with carbon in it. I can send those both to the laboratory. The carbon will come out to maybe 35,000 years old, and the uranium will come out to 100 million.
Oh, so there's contradictions there.
Huge contradiction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did God create a rattlesnake to bite and kill other animals?
That's a question I've wrestled with. I don't know if there's a completely clear answer to that, and that's like why it's still a question. For rattlesnakes specifically, rattlesnakes belong to a class of snakes that are the pit vipers. Vipers are, there's several different types of venomous snakes, and they have different configurations of their fangs. Some have relatively simple fangs at the back of their mouth that maybe are grooved. Some have short fixed fangs in the front of their mouth. But the vipers, they have this elaborate system where they're actually big, long fangs that fold. So they're part of their bones are like hinges in the front of their jaw that they fold these fangs. The other part that's interesting is that the venom in the glands itself, this is a toxic mixture of stuff. And so there was a scientist kind of like, well, these big venom glands are pretty close to their brain. This seems like a liability to have this toxic stuff there. And it turns out the toxins in that venom gland are actually deactivated while it's in the snake. So these venom toxins are, there's different ways. One of the interesting ways is they respond to pH. So the venom glands of some snakes have essentially cells in them like the cells in your stomach that secrete acid. And so they keep it a high acidic environment in the venom gland. And that essentially deactivates the toxin.
So you're saying...
And then when it bites you, The pH shift activates the toxins.
So when we're looking at animals that have these mechanisms, these tools for survival or killing or predatorial behaviors, you're saying something like snake venom might have a precursor to being some kind of digestive enzyme, or it still is?
Yeah, there's several ways you could try to explain it from the biblical perspective, right? So one, you could talk about you've taken something that was benign that existed, let's say in Eden, and you shifted it now. So you can see that potentially with the venom toxin components themselves, right? There are some, it could be a digestive enzyme that now gets shifted and is expressed in venom, and that digests tissue, right? Or things like that. You can, in fact, if you're an evolutionary biologist, that's some of the way you explain venom toxins too. They're co-opted for different parts. Other aspects, though, like just the complexity of this whole system seems to say this almost seems designed, but did God design this? Maybe the enemy designs this?
Yeah. You know, in Scripture, you do see this sort of cascading sort of fall that happens not just in humanity, but all of life. You know, Stephen Jay Gould, who was obviously a proponent of evolution, but also modified this idea, one of his critiques of evolution was, look, based upon our mathematical understanding of evolution, it's not just that we should be looking for certain what he called transitional fossils that are missing apparently, but he says it's the amount. We should be seeing fossils and all sorts of, you know, creatures in the ground everywhere, he says, but they're just not in the ground. They're just not in the fossil record.
Yeah, this is why he tried. I mean, he definitely was not a creationist. No. And that's sort of why he came up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium, where it's sort of like this idea that maybe gradual evolution is real, but a certain population runs off in a corner and doesn't get fossilized, and then, you know, it's the transitional form, and then a big population comes out, and those are the ones that get preserved, and so we have an explanation for why we have gaps. Yeah.
Right. We learned from a previous episode. When you do have rapid changes, though, it doesn't create advantages for the species. It actually creates disadvantages.
The standard version of evolution is supposed to work in terms of mutations, right? And so, but what generally happens is, you know, small tweaks here and there, you can still have a functioning organism, and sometimes maybe the mutation helps with something. Other times it might be slightly detrimental, not hurt it too much, but it can still function. But if you have a major change, like a major mutation that's going to cause a major change, those are invariably lethal. You know, it's not like the movies, right? In the movies, you can bombard a lizard with gamma radiation or something and mutate it and it becomes Godzilla. Right? In real life, you just kill the poor lizard.
Yeah, that's right. Who'd like to go first? Right over there.
Hello. So I was wondering, from a scientist who's also religious, how do you believe that dinosaurs became extinct?
All right, that is a good question. Dinosaurs have always been something interesting to me. Even when I was a kid, dinosaurs are just awesome. So within a creationist timeline, if you're talking about young Earth creationism, there are two general views. All right, one is that the flood destroyed them and they went extinct at the flood. And the other is that Noah actually took some dinosaurs on the ark. Maybe they were, because we tend to think of dinosaurs as enormous, but they actually started out relatively small, young. So the idea is maybe not a giant dinosaur, but at least a young dinosaur is on the ark. And then those actually went extinct shortly after the flood. Some flood models describe the ice age happening right after the flood, and there's certain reasons for that. I'm sure maybe Monty here could explain those better than me, but maybe they weren't adapted to the cold and they went extinct shortly thereafter. So those are the two basic views of what happened to the dinosaurs from a creationist perspective.
You know, it's kind of a mystery to a lot of people, a lot of us, because the Bible doesn't mention the word dinosaur. In fact, the word dinosaur is actually a fairly modern term. I think in the 1800s that paleontology really began to solidify as a science. So, of course, we're not going to see that word when Moses was writing the Pentateuch, and he wasn't saying these are dinosaurs, these are mammals, he was just like animals. Large animals, land animals, sea animals, right? There wasn't a classification to him.
Right, and yeah, it is modern. Who is it? Sir Richard Owen was the person who coined the term dinosaur, late 1800s, I guess it was. And so, yeah, our taxonomic distinctions that we have now aren't something that the Bible writers would understand or think about. And in fact, I think that's true with most dinosaurs today. When most people say dinosaur, they're thinking about all these weird extinct creatures. When a paleontologist thinks of dinosaurs, they're thinking of something fairly narrow. There's these, they're all land animals generally. They have a particular hip structure, and that's what a paleontologist thinks of as a dinosaur. So things like the Loch Ness monster, you know, with the long neck, that's technically not a dinosaur. Maybe you would call it a plesiosaur or something like that. Or those pterosaurs, pterodactyls we tend to call them, those technically aren't dinosaurs either. So yeah, taxonomy is very different, I think, for a biblical writer than a modern systematist. Yeah.